My name is Dr. Lindsay Santacroce, and I am the Scientific Applications Specialist here at BrainBox. And today I will be talking to you guys about how to execute an effective conference poster. Like Ada said, I will be taking a lot of questions at the end. That's probably one of the more exciting parts about our webinars. So I will be taking all those at the end, but if you have any questions throughout, be sure to write them in the Q&A section of the chat, and I will make sure to touch on all of those at the end. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about me and my credentials so that you can have an idea of my background. So I do have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, as well as some postdoc experience. And while getting these degrees and getting all this experience in academia, I have presented 13 first author conference posters. As you can see, I take them very, very seriously. I also taught a poster project in my undergraduate class that I taught at University of Houston. So that was one of their final projects, was to make a poster, because I think they're super important and it's a tough skill to learn. So I do prioritize that as much as possible. I was also the judge for the poster award at this past BrainBox Initiative conference in London, and I hope to continue to be the award judge in the future. So I also have really strong opinions about how posters should be set up. So I'm just very excited to get into this today. When I was asked to do a webinar, I was like, of course, I want to do it on posters because they're my favorite. Okay, so let's start with, in general, what is a conference poster? So a conference poster is a great way to present your research to other scientists from all over the world. And it's good to receive helpful feedback or spark discussions for future directions on your research. Conversations at poster sessions might generate new ideas, prepare you for reviewer or committee feedback on your research. It could help you think about your research in a new light if you're getting somebody who is potentially outside of your specific field of research. It can even land you a new job. So obviously, posters are a crucial part of your academic career. However, it seems that academic training rarely teaches you how to make an effective poster. You're kind of expected to just pick it up as you go along, which for one can be very scary, especially when you're first starting off. And it's also incredibly difficult, and it's a skill. It's a very difficult skill, and it's hard to know if you're doing it right without proper training, which is why I really wanted to host this webinar today. I'm hoping that in this short amount of time, I can try to provide some guidance on what makes an effective poster. So to first get a better understanding of what makes a conference poster, let's first go over the poster session, which can look something like this. This is the Society for Neuroscience, or SFN's, annual conference, which is notoriously large, but still pretty representative of the classic poster session layout. As you can see, there are posters upon posters pretty much as far as the eye can see. So your competition is super saturated here. You have a lot of posters. Timing can vary depending on the conference you're at, but specifically for SFN, they allow you to display your poster for 4 hours, and you must be by your poster ready to present for just one of those hours. So during your poster session, your goal is to try to attract as many people to your poster as possible. And then during your hour, your goal is to speak with as many interested researchers as possible. At the same time, the conference attendees' goal is to see as many relevant posters as possible during the poster session. So the conference attendee might accomplish their goal in a number of ways, and it's important to understand these ways before considering how to accomplish your goal. Depending on the conference, the attendees might come from a whole bunch of different backgrounds. They might be just general researchers in a wide, broad range of topics like SFN, that's just broadly neuroscience, or it could be a little more specific, like Vision Sciences Society, for example, that has a conference just for vision scientists. So they could be general or more specific to your particular field, and that's important to keep in mind. Attendees can also be from any career stage, so not just faculty members, but you'll also see grad students, postdocs, undergrads, sometimes even just the casual scientist. And like I said, they could be from within or outside of your niche topic. So when you're thinking about the audience for your poster, you want to consider them as intellectual researchers primarily, who do know a lot about science, but aren't necessarily super versed in your niche topic. And that's kind of important to keep in mind. So your goal is to have as many of these types of intellectual conversations during your session, where the attendee might be asking you questions, providing you feedback, or giving their own hypotheses on follow-up studies, perhaps. But you'll also have this guy who is interested in hearing what the poster presenter is saying, but isn't fully ready to commit to the entire spiel. So he's just keeping his distance for now until he feels maybe that this poster is worth his time, because again, the time is limited. You'll also see this person quite often who's just slowly walking by and glancing at the titles, trying to gauge if any one poster is worth their time. They're probably trying to avoid eye contact with anyone specific at their poster because they're just trying to figure out what is worth their time in, again, this very short amount of time. You'll sometimes also see this guy here who is trying to scrutinize parts of your poster without talking to you. Usually they would do this while you aren't at your poster, like during the 3 hours your poster is displayed at SFN, but you're not standing by it presenting. But sometimes they'll even do this while you're standing right there. And if you ask, like, do you want the run through? And they'll say no, but you know, that is a person that does exist sometimes. So it's important to keep everyone in mind. So your overarching goal during your poster session is to turn these bystanders into this engaged researcher. But again, time in a poster session is limited, so you need to make sure you're being aware of both your time and the attendees' time. So all that being said, it is difficult to come up with very specific rules for how to make a poster because it can differ by so many different things, like what your specific topic is, how many experiments you have, are you using different kinds of machines, what's common in your specific line of research. So it's hard to come up with like specific rules that'll match everybody, but there are some general rules I want to go over that you should just keep in mind. So your poster presentation should first capture attention. Again, this is a very saturated poster session with a lot to look at in a very short amount of time. You want to make sure that your poster can capture the attention of people there so that maybe they'll want to come up and engage in conversation with you, which again is the goal. You also want to efficiently relay important information, keeping in mind the space that you have on your poster and the time you have to present. So you want to be very efficient with how you relay your information. Posters should somewhat be able to stand on their own for the people who are looking at your poster when you aren't present. But with that being said, it should also be visible from far away for people who are standing further back and kind of not looking to fully commit to standing up by your poster. So even those people should be able to see your poster from further away and kind of understand what's going on. And most importantly, your poster should be able to start a conversation with other researchers. This makes the most out of your conference experience. So You want to be able to start a conversation. Don't give them too much information right away. Okay, so what a poster should not be. It should not overwhelm or confuse. You don't want to include so much information that whoever's looking at your poster is leaving your poster overwhelmed, like, wow, that was so much information. I have no idea what was actually happening. You want to make sure no one's super confused when you leave. You also don't want it to be a copy of your paper or your thesis, dissertation, etc. I know everyone here probably spends a lot of time on their research project. So much time doing very small things that everything seems super important to you, every detail. And all that stuff is great to include in your dissertation or the paper, but it can't be a copy on, you can't copy your paper onto your poster because a lot of the information just isn't necessary. So that can be a little tricky, but make sure we're not doing it. A poster should also, you should avoid taking more than 2 minutes to go over your poster. I'll get into this a little bit later, but again, people have very limited amount of time. You don't want to have someone actually be willing to come up and talk to you, and then you spend 10 minutes walking them through a poster. Usually, there will be some people who will be kind of like, okay, hurry up, or sometimes people will just straight up just walk away from you, which is very disheartening. So you want to make sure to be mindful of their time. Very quick, to the point, and if they have follow-up questions, that's great. That's what we want. We want to start conversation. Okay, so I want to hone in on the points about viewability. This is perhaps the most important aspect of a poster, to make it readable from far away and enjoyable enough to want to start a conversation with less information. So a few rules to help with viewability. You want to keep your words to a minimum. Posters shouldn't have full sentences. So pretty much avoid periods at the end of any statement at all costs. Definitely shouldn't have paragraphs, so make sure we're at least keeping bullet points. And if words can be replaced with a figure, always do that. Try to avoid too many words because it's so much less interesting to just look at a wall of text than it is to look at figures. That might make it a little bit easier to understand your poster from further away. Similarly, images should be big. This is what's capturing your attention. This is what's important. Your graphs with your data are very important. The task you're using, very important. So those need to be big. The main drivers of your poster. You want to be able to see those from far away and say, oh, this person did a task that I'm familiar with. Maybe I need to go up and talk to that person. The smallest text on your poster should be at least 30-point font, except the references, we'll get into that. But even then, that's pretty small on a poster from far away. So do not go lower than 30-point font if you must, but try to stay above that if you can, because other than that, you really won't be able to see it from far away. I've tested this theory with a bunch of different font sizes and stepped back to see where I could see them. 30-point is the minimum that I found. So if you can't seem to fit text in your poster, keeping it above 30-point font, you need to take some text away. And you only need to include what's needed for your main point. This is probably one of the more difficult things to do, but you need to really think about what your overarching question is, the point, the story you're trying to relay, and try not to include any information that doesn't directly answer that question. Posters should also have a natural flow so that it's easy to see where the start, middle, and end goes. It's not always going to be in the same order, but as long as it naturally flows, that's key. And it's also really helpful to keep consistent cues throughout. Like if you use one color to label the different types of stimuli you're using, for the different conditions. Maybe that's the color that you use in the graphs for those conditions. If you use dotted lines, make sure those stay consistent throughout. If you use certain font for headers, make sure every header uses that font so that it makes it clear. It gives your attendees or the viewers cues that, oh, this is a main section. Oh, okay, this line goes with this condition that I learned over here. So keeping these little cues consistent throughout your poster is incredibly helpful. And also, don't be afraid to have fun with it, because again, people don't want to look at a wall of text. They want to look at something that somebody put energy into, that they made look nice, or had some fun with it. You'll see my lab's logo in a bit, but we had a logo that looked like Gary the snail with a brain, and that was fun. Sometimes people will come up to talk to us about that logo, which I always found fun. But yeah, so don't be afraid to have fun with it. We're all researchers at the end of the day. We're all scientists. We're not necessarily trying to adhere to like what we think a scientist should look like, because that's what we are. So have fun. Okay, so now let's get into the general sections of a poster. Like I said, the poster layout can differ greatly depending on your specific experiment, your specific topic. A lot of different things can vary, but the basic sections should be your introduction, method, results, conclusion, and references. Of course, also you'll have your header at the top, which should have your poster's title very big, the author's names a little smaller, and then the affiliations below that even smaller. You'll usually have logos off to the side, can be your university's logo or your lab's logo, or sometimes even the conference's logo or your funding agency's logo, etc. It's also nice to have like contact information on the header so that it's easy for whoever's looking at it. Sometimes people will take pictures of your poster also. That'll make it easy for people to contact you if they need to. Okay, so starting with the introduction. This is one of my posters that I've done in the past. I am going to use a lot of my posters as examples of what to do and what not to do. So yeah, these aren't random posters. These are just ones that I'll use. So you'll see very similar kind of themes, but this poster here that I did, I think has a very solid introduction that hits all the key points very clearly. So you first want to start by highlighting the overarching theory. So like for mine, it was emotional stimuli are thought to capture attention in spite of your task goals. And then you want to define the main terms. My study looked at the attentional blink and the emotional attentional blink. So I went ahead and labeled them here. I defined what the attentional blink and the emotional attentional blink is after that. And then you're going to mention the gap, which I did that here. It's also stating my research question. I kind of merged the two things into the one bullet point, saying the current study directly compares the attentional blink to the emotional attentional blink to determine the relative strength. So that's pretty much just saying previous research hasn't done that, so this is what I'm going to be doing all in one bullet point. And as you can see, this is very short and sweet. This was my entire dissertation, more or less. And I managed to put the background into 4 very simple bullet points, because those are exactly what I need to tell the audience so that they understand exactly what I'm doing without giving them too much information. I could go into some more specific theories about why emotional stimuli capture attention, but that's not really important. The important part is that this is what people think, and this is what I'm adding to the literature. And also in-text citations should be numbered and not written out. Sometimes they can be written out in full if it's like you're doing a very specific replication of what this one researcher did. Maybe that's a time when you would want to write out the full in-text citation. But as a general rule, to save space and text, which again, seeing text on a screen is kind of hard to look at. So you want to avoid extra text, and in-text citations can be extra text that isn't necessarily required. So try to use in-text citations like numbered that you can then reference later on. Okay, so what you're not going to want to do, these are some examples of previous posters of mine that used a bit too much information. So you can see that these are all, like this one's a full paragraph. This was early in my poster days in undergrad, both of these. You can see full, like full paragraphs, full in-text citations, way too much information about like what the attentional blink is, more so, that's just an extra phrase that's not needed. So you can just see that these are examples of just way too much text, way too much information that doesn't really aid my story. It's just filler, basically. Okay, so now the method section. Some general rules. Figures, you should always try to use figures instead of text. Figures are like the best part of the method section. As you can see here, it's pretty much only figures with just a few important text information, and explain only what directly answers your research question. A lot of the times people will do a lot of extra extra things in their study. For example, most of my studies always used surveys for the participants ahead of time, just general surveys that pretty much anybody uses for any cognitive study. But that kind of thing doesn't answer my question. I don't analyze that. It's not important. So while I would need to disclose that I did that in the research paper or my dissertation, that's not something that belongs in a poster. That's just extra information. It doesn't help move the story along, and it wouldn't be that important. And again, allow space for conversation. So you don't want to give them necessarily, like, not withholding information, but sometimes there is information that might be good to include, but if you don't have space, or if it feels like just extra words for the average attendee, maybe that's something that could be a question. Like if I said, like off to the side here in this example that I'm showing you here, this is just 5 stimuli from what I use rapid serial visual presentation, which is just flashing things in your face really fast. And I think I used like 12 items in my real streams to my participants, but here I only display 5. But I didn't write that we had 12 total words, because that's not really important to what I'm doing. If it was important, I would show it, not tell it. But somebody might ask, oh, okay, this could be important because of these reasons. How many stimuli did you use per stream? And that just creates conversation, right? That's just a question, and it's fairly easy to answer. And just make sure you have all the information in your back pocket just in case. But if it's not something that directly answers your research question, you don't necessarily need to include it. Okay, so here's some different examples, again, of my posters that I've done before, and I'm going to kind of point out some things that I think, like different specific things. Because like I said, like posters can vary. The way you're setting them up can vary depending on a lot of different circumstances. Like it's not always going to follow these strict rules. So I'm just going to kind of show you just very broadly things that I've done and specific reasons why I've done that. So this first poster here, I used one very shortened RSVP stream, that rapid serial visual presentation stream, where there's just a bunch of images flashing. Obviously, again, I didn't need to show the whole stream because that's not important. I just showed 5 key items, and then I showed the 2 different distractor items that could exist. What it is not super important, but I showed that there were 2 different conditions here, and this is how I showed it instead of explaining it. I said, this is the target, and from here, there's a distractor. So this is something that was important to my study. The RSVP timing wasn't super important, so I made it kind of small right here, like how many seconds each image was displayed for. Not super important, but I still put that there to, like, just in case. And the responses here, the way that the participants selected the targets, I put those very big in this poster because it was super important, because this corresponds with different kind of ways that people can process information. So yeah, this was for perceptual processing, semantic processing. Regardless, that doesn't matter. But the point is that for this particular study, the way that the participants responded to the questions mattered. So I made those pretty big. And then these tiny notes here are pretty much to cover my back, like saying that I didn't use IAPS images in these figures because those aren't public, and that I adapted a paradigm from somebody else. So other than that, I didn't include anything that I felt was too much information. Okay, so in my second poster here, both of these RSVP stream types mattered. So I also needed to have more images because more of the positions mattered in this case, right? So I needed to make sure I labeled each of the streams and each of the items in the stream. Whereas here, I only labeled the specific items that mattered, that being either the target or the distractor, and then the other target. But here, the fact that I had filler images and blank screens made it so I had to label each item because it all mattered. And then the CDIs, or the critical distractors, still mattered. And then also the speed mattered less again. And you'll notice that there's a dotted line underneath skeletal here, and that will matter later. I'll show you that later, but that was to maintain consistency, again, while I was talking about those cues. Okay, so for this one, the category of the different distractors are what mattered the most, so I made sure to make those very big and obvious. And again, speed was less important. And here, again, the categories mattered the most, which is why I highlighted them down here. I labeled them E1 versus E2, which is what I'll talk about that in a bit. And also for this one specific, my time course sensitivity mattered. So how fast I displayed each of the images, or each of the text in this case, it did matter because I was going faster than other streams. So whereas here I would put the time like kind of small in a corner, I made the time a main point on this poster here because it did matter a little bit more than it did in other studies that I ran. So one thing you'll notice that is you don't see a lot of participant information in my method sections. And that's because I used really basic cognitive tasks for a lot of my, and I did this in healthy participants. So the actual participants didn't, again, matter too much for my story, to tell my story. I will put the sample size usually in the graphs, but I feel like that goes more with results. But there are times when that isn't the case, when participant information does matter, such as this other study that I did where I was looking at older and younger adults. So here, the fact that I used 46 younger adults and 45 older adults and put their age ranges did matter. So because I was doing an aging study. Another time participant info might matter is if you maybe have patients with anxiety or depression, other types of disorders, or other clinical populations. Certain information about the participants might matter. But again, it's important to just stick to what's important for your specific question. In this poster here, participant information did matter, whereas in my other studies, it did not. What you don't want to see is something like this, which is the participant information from this study in the paper, right? Like I did take all of these measures for all of my participants, and I looked at the means and standard deviations, older versus younger adults, did t-tests, all of that good stuff. But like this doesn't belong on a poster. This is just extra text that is just not needed in most cases. And again, this isn't necessarily always the case, but I would say 9 times out of 10, you do not need anything like as excessive as this is. Usually just like a short little bullet or something will suffice. Also want to note that this was an EEG study, so some more information on the EEG analysis was important. And I used these, like I was saying about the color cues, I highlighted the text in green and labeled the parts of the brain here that I used in green that corresponded with these different components. And I did the same for orange. And I'll show you the results section later where I maintained these colors throughout. Again, just kind of giving people those visual cues. What you don't want to see is these kinds of things. You'll see that the text, first of all, is way too small, way too small. No one can read this from far away. There's full paragraphs, just a wall of text. Way too much, if you read it carefully, there's too much participant information, like around like where the participants came from. They were University of Florida students. Like that kind of stuff doesn't really matter too much. The figures are super small because there was a lot of text that needed to be fit. So the figures are too small, and I don't know why the figures are labeled as if people are going to read the text and go to the figure as if it's like a paper. Again, posters shouldn't be papers. They should be posters. Okay, so now results. This is the largest, most important section. Obviously, your results are the big deal. Similar to methods, graphs and figures should always replace text if possible. Make sure to use minimal statistics. Again, only what's important for your research question. We don't need the full F table for every little ANOVA that you ran. We just need the main point, maybe just the p-values, or the Bayes factors, whatever you use, but really sometimes you don't need actual numbers at all, and just like stars to indicate significance matters. And again, like this can help start a conversation too. Like if people have questions about things that didn't directly answer your question, they might ask you. Just make sure you have that in your back pocket. Okay, so I'm going to show you some more posters. You can see here in this poster, I put the N in the corner of the graphs here to show the number of participants ran, because again, it's not super important, but I feel like it belongs more for my studies that I did here. It matters more in the results than it did in the methods. I had 2 simple large graphs in each experiment. The lines and the colors were consistent. You can see I labeled the different conditions with the different images below, and then those corresponded with the colors in the graphs. The dotted line corresponded to the underline that I showed in the previous slide, but I'll show you that again here in a second. I answered my questions directly. These were my research questions. I said, and I used checks and X's to make it easy to understand and draw your attention to the main takeaway points. We said check, EAB effect was observed. And X, it was not affected by the different types of tasks. So, and I have like little tiny stats down below to show how I came with that, but the main point is that I answered the question. Here you go. That's the answer. This one is similar. I answered the question here in the headers, which was cool. The COVID-19 pandemic words decreased the EAB, and Hurricane Harvey images decreased the EAB. So that's like a cool trick you can do, is put the answers just in the header. For this particular situation, two kinds of stats were important because I analyzed something a little different than other people have analyzed it. So me including both like stats here was a little bit more important, which is why you'll see more stats in this poster than maybe this other poster. And then here I was measuring blink duration with t-tests at each time point, which was a very difficult thing to figure out how to convey on a poster. But I figured out that the best way wasn't to include any of the T statistics, just X's and checks where there were differences, X's where there weren't. And off to the side here, I described what those checks and X's corresponded with Bayes factors greater than 3, etc. And each condition needed its own graph because when they were stacked on top of each other, it was difficult to see. So the spacing here was like difficult to figure out. I also want to point out the consistency that I used. The underlines here for the different conditions here corresponded with the same type of underline that I used inside of the graphs. Again, just giving that visual cue of what goes with what. Okay, so results can be tricky. Again, like I said, for my EEG poster, these were all of my stats. You can see I looked at the amplitude and latency of 3 different ERP components. Each used a 3-way ANOVA. And what I've written in bullets are the significant results of the ANOVAs with follow-up stats in parentheses. So each of these 3 components had an ERP waveform graph plus a graph for the amplitude and the latency, and separated for older and younger adults. I also had separate older and younger adult graphs for different measures of the behavioral data. So all of this means that I started with a total of around 20 graphs and a ton of result information that needed to fit onto one poster. So I had to think about what was most important to include here. I ended up removing the latency graphs altogether because the results, as they related to age group, didn't add much to my overall story. But it did lead to conversations at my poster when people who were extremely curious about this topic, maybe not just the general person, wanted to know about the latencies. I had that in my back pocket to tell them, here were the latency results, but I didn't feel like it added to my story on the poster. I also merged some graphs together to make things a bit easier to follow. And as far as actual statistics go, I really just stuck with using stars for some of the most important within graph comparisons, like you can see some stars here, because no numbers were really necessary. And again, people who are interested, who are uber interested, will ask. They'll ask for these numbers if you want them. So just make sure to have them like ready to go in your back pocket so that when you get these questions, you're able to answer them. And again, I also want to point out that I kept the colors and the lines consistent. You could see the solid lines are for social, the dashed are for non-social, and that is maintained in the waveform graphs as well as all the other graphs here. Okay, so methods and results section can get tricky with multiple experiments. So like I was saying, I guess the layout format doesn't always follow a specific pattern. It can change up a lot, and you'll probably have noticed that already. But when you have multiple experiments, there are different ways to work with that. Here, this poster here, I had a general method section where I generally described what happened, and then off to the side I wrote one experiment used words, one of them used images. And then I kind of treated experiment 1 and 2 as being two separate conditions, even though they were two separate experiments. And so that this layout still had a defined results and method section. In the second poster, I also used a general method section where I used symbols to represent what the different items could be. And then I broke it off to the side and wrote for specific experiments what the stimuli actually looked like inside each experiment. And I labeled it the key in the header for each experiment and what it corresponded with. So here I put the specific method and results section together. You'll see it's next to the grid. So this was a way I was able to set this up. And this is pretty common when you have multi-experiment studies. I already kind of pointed this one out. So this one also kept one method section because the experiment differences were very slight. They didn't need separate sections. So I highlighted the slight differences within the same section here, and it was just with the kind of conditions I used. And then I separated the graphs down here by experiments, which basically showed that experiment 2 was just a replication of experiment 1 plus an extension. So you can see how these graphs look similar and then these ones look different. So this is replication, extension. So that was another way that I put two experiments and still separated method and results. And this poster also didn't have a separate method section at all. So this one also had method and results section in one for each of the experiments. Sometimes this is probably the most common way to do this because it's easier to explain things stepwise. You say, oh, experiment 1, we used this paradigm and found this. Experiment 2, this paradigm, we found this. What you don't want to do is separate a method section, say experiment 1, we did this, experiment 2, we did this, then move on to your results and say experiment 1, we found this, experiment 2, we found this, because that's relying on your viewer remembering what you said over here, which they probably will, but the possibility that they don't is there. So it's easier to say what I did, what I found, what I did, what I found, versus what I did, what I did, what I found, what I found. If that makes sense. And I asked and answered the question directly in the header, which was easy. And again, okay, so now the conclusion section. The conclusion should very briefly describe your results. So here, these first two, I successfully used this novel task for this common phenomenon, and they yielded similar results. There were no differences. Those were my two main takeaway points. So that was checked. I answered my question. In that second one was, will decreasing the number, will this increase the EAB? And in the conclusion section, so this is my background and conclusion. And then here I answered that question. And I also related back to the overarching theory, which is that like emotion captures attention. And this is saying, well, this isn't why. And again, leave room for conversation. Don't necessarily put everything. Don't be exhaustive in your conclusion section, because this is especially where people are going to want to talk to you about the theories, about follow-up. You can sometimes put a future directions in there. Usually you'll want to do this if you are actively doing an experiment, but it's also not super necessary. And again, what you're not going to want to do is have full text, full walls of text in your conclusion section, because this is just very difficult to look at. Nobody's reading all that at your poster. That guy standing further away can't see this, so it's pointless to put all these words there. Save space, for figures. And references are the smallest section. Font size doesn't really matter here. You got to pretty much do what you can to make it fit. But you are going to want to number the references in order of appearance. Like I said in the intro side or section, you're just going to want to have little numbers for the references, and they'll correspond to the reference section. And if there's space, you can add an acknowledgements. But you can see here, that's the reference section for this poster, and that's the reference section for this poster. So very small. It's important, obviously, to have them there, but it's, again, not super important to your question. So you don't want to make that a main point necessarily. Again, leave room for conversation. People who are really interested in it will come up and look at it, look and see what you cited potentially, but it's not something that's going to help your poster tell a story. So that can be kind of small, but crucial nonetheless. Okay, so now that we've gone through the sections, let's talk briefly about the presentation. So the poster presentation can be scary, obviously, but some things to keep in mind is to keep it less than 2 minutes. It should not be more than 2 minutes. Like I said, people will just walk away from you. It's not super common, but it can happen. It's usually the same person to scrutinize a section of your poster. Not to generalize, but it can happen. So don't waste people's time. There's been times I've gone up to a poster and realized in the first 2 seconds of the person talking that, oh, this isn't as relevant to my research as I thought it would be. And they still go into every little detail. And I'm like stuck there for like 12 minutes. And I'm like, I have so many other posters, so little time. So just for everybody's sake, just keep it under 2 minutes. It's hard, but you got this. You want to make sure you flow through the poster. Make sure you gesture to the different sections as you're talking about them, but don't necessarily need to point out words, just kind of point at figures and like lead them to where you are talking at that very moment so that they're not trying to read things that don't matter. It's good to gesture. Like I said, gesture to figures. And skip unimportant info. Even if it's on your poster, it's not necessarily important enough to speak about. Again, you're going to want to keep this under 2 minutes. So just skip everything that's like even though the amount, like the age ranges of my older versus younger adults mattered enough to put on the poster, I didn't put that in my speech that I said to people because I just said we used older and younger adults. And a lot of people, a question was, what were the age ranges? Like a follow-up question. And then I was able to answer that. And it was on the poster, but it didn't necessarily warrant a whole 2 seconds in my 2-minute speech. And also don't be afraid to ask the attendee their knowledge level. When I start my attentional blink posters, I always started with I would sometimes say, do you want the 2-minute version or the 5-minute version? Give them like options depending on how interested they are. And I would always start it with how familiar are you with the attentional blink? Because sometimes people will come up to you who do the exact same thing you do, and you don't want to waste time explaining to them something they already know. But a lot of the times you'll get people who are like, oh, I've never heard that before. I'm into vision research, but I haven't done that specific thing before. So then you will briefly explain what that is. So it is good to ask the knowledge level. And again, leave room for discussion and questions, and confidence is key. So I'm gonna go through this poster and present it how I would. This is a pretty simple poster, so I'm just gonna go through it so you can get an idea of what I cut out and what I keep in. So I would start with asking, are you familiar with the emotional attentional blink? Assuming they say yes, I move forward. Assuming they say no, I said, okay, well, in the emotional attentional blink, in a rapid presentation of flashing stimuli, a task irrelevant stimulus that is very emotional is able to capture your attention, and you're unable to report a target that shortly follows the presentation of that emotional stimulus. This EAB effect, emotional attentional blank, or EAB effect, has been shown to be larger in participants with PTSD, in veterans who were shown distractors that were combat related. So I wanted to see if this also happened in healthy participants without PTSD who did experience a widespread tragic event. So experiment 1, I used, here's me gesturing. Experiment 1, I used words related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in their stream, the distractor, the emotional distractor, could either be a COVID-19 word like virus, or a classic emotional word that's taboo or baseline. And I found that the COVID word did not capture attention and did not create a blank. So experiment 2, I used images that were related to Hurricane Harvey. So I used images from the hurricane that happened in Houston compared to matched images of just Houston, and then the classic, unpleasant, and neutral and baseline stimuli. And I again found that there was no emotional attentional blank from Hurricane Harvey related images, which suggests that stimuli associated with firsthand traumatic events do not increase the emotional attentional blank. Full stop. So very quick, I didn't go into the stats. I didn't go too far into the actual task itself. If somebody was confused, they would ask, but a lot of the times people would know what the task is. So I could kind of skip that stuff a little bit. And I just basically went over briefly the background, briefly what I did and what I found. Didn't even gesture to over here, just gestured to the task, graph, pretty easy. Okay, so I don't know how I am on time, but now I wanted to do some tools, tips, and tricks. So, okay, so first thing I'm gonna show you is, I'm assuming you can still see the screen, right? Yeah. So this is a handy website where you can find poster templates. This is what I kind of use as a start. They have, make sure you pay attention to what your conference says size-wise, but they have just different poster templates for the different sizes of posters that you're going to want. And it just has a basic general outline, which you obviously can edit a lot and probably will edit a lot. But this is a good way to get just a poster PowerPoint template that's a large size. It is like real size on the actual, so like the file's really large, be warned. But that's crucial for when you're printing out the poster. It needs to be the correct resolution. So yeah, this is a good template website. Okay, so Slide Master. It's one of my favorite tips and tricks, right? For PowerPoint in general, but this is extremely helpful with posters. So ignore what I'm pressing right now. Why isn't this working? Oh, I'm done because it's because it's a background in the Slide Master. Ignore me. So when you're working with a poster, a lot of the times these sections will be like separated, like the text is separated, and you'll move it a lot accidentally, and that's always super annoying when you just move a background and you're just trying to move like a figure. And then you have to like rewind. And when you're sizing things, it sizes based on like, it snaps the sizing. It'll snap to like an edge that you don't want it to snap to, and it just adds too much. It's hard to work with. So if you go to View and then Slide Master over here, it takes you to basically a way to make a template. So I have an important tab here, but that's just because I made that myself. But you'll just have a home tab. So here is where you can edit like the sections. So let's say we need the method section to be much bigger. We can size it here. And size it. Move things around however you need it to be moved around. Hard to move in the second screen. The second screen is not responsive. And then when you close Slide Master View, now this isn't movable. You can't click this or move it. It's a part of the background, basically. So this is an easy way to make the backgrounds of your poster so that you can't accidentally move things around. Align sections to make a lot of the different things you can, or to make like figures and stuff. Graphics format, align, and align to the middle. Helpful. Align, you can distribute horizontally so that you can make a solid figure like that. Please use these things. They're be nice when you're looking at things. One other thing, or two more things. When you're working with graphs, PowerPoint really hates working with graphs that come from Excel. It sometimes will crash, especially when it's a really big poster file. So I recommend making your graph, copying it, Control-C, and then pasting as an image. And then when you're moving into the poster, you can work with this instead onto your poster so that you don't accidentally like move things like that. That's always like really annoying when you accidentally move. And so also it doesn't crash out. One last thing is when you have a graph the exact way that you want it done, and you want to like replicate that into another place or like into another graph, instead of having to redo all that same lines and all of that, you can just save it as a template and save it however you want. You can see I have a bunch of them already saved, and then you can just select that like change chart type, then go to your templates, and then you'll find all your templates here, and then you can just select it. Okay, and it changes it. Okay, whatever, it doesn't exist right now, but pretend it does. Okay, so those were my tips and tricks. Thank you, everyone. I will take questions now.